In the deepening gloom of an autumn evening in 1753, a carriage of unremarkable appearance moved slowly through the fog-choked streets of Versailles. It was a vehicle designed for anonymity, devoid of the gilded crests or intricate armorial bearings that usually announce the presence of the French nobility. Its heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the damp, clinging mist, concealing the passengers within from the curious eyes of the cobblestone streets. The carriage wheels clattered rhythmically, splashing through the mud of the Saint Louis district, a quiet corner of the royal city that lay in the literal and metaphorical shadow of the Great Palace. Inside this carriage sat a young girl named Marie-Louise O'Murphy, known to her family and the rough streets of her childhood simply as Louison. She was at a fragile age, having seen no more than 14 winters. She stood on the precipice between the innocence of childhood and the sudden, overwhelming expectations of an adult world she did not understand. Her hands, red and rough from years of assisting in her father's workshop, for she was a cobbler's daughter, acquainted with the smell of leather and the grit of labor, were folded tightly in her lap. They trembled visibly, not merely from the biting cold that seeped through the carriage floor, but from a swirling, nauseating mixture of nervousness and a fragile, naive hope. Her mother had told her that very morning, with eyes shining with a desperate sort of joy, that their fortunes had irrevocably changed. She spoke of a miracle. She said that a great nobleman, a man of immense wealth, piety, and influence at court, had heard of Louison's quiet charm and emerging beauty. This benefactor, she explained, wished to sponsor Louison's education entirely. Louison was told she would leave the grime of her old life behind. She was promised that she would learn to read the great works of literature, to sing with the grace of an opera star, and to behave like a refined lady of the court. It was a fairy tale spun in a dimly lit room, a promise of salvation for a family constantly teetering on the brink of destitution. But as the carriage finally slowed and came to a halt, the reality began to assert itself. They did not stop in front of a convent school or a bustling academy of arts. Instead, the horses stood snorting in the cold air in front of a modest, secluded mansion, surrounded by walls so high they seemed designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. Louison did not see a school. She saw a fortress built of secrets, standing silent in the fog. The heavy iron gates of the house, known to the few who whispered about it as the Parc aux Cerfs, the deer park, swung open with a heavy groan to swallow the carriage whole. When Louison finally stepped out, her boots clicking on the paved courtyard, she was not greeted by the warm smiles of teachers or the stern looks of governesses. Instead, she was met by silent, efficient servants who moved like ghosts. They ushered her quickly out of sight of the street, as if her very presence were a contraband item that must be hidden. The air inside the house was stiflingly warm and smelled of expensive lavender water, burning beeswax candles, and something else, a sterile, suffocating silence that pressed against her ears. That very evening, the systematic process of redefining Louison O'Murphy began. It was not a violent erasure, but a thorough, bureaucratic one. She was stripped of her cheap, patched woolen clothes, the garments that still smelled of her mother's cooking and the city streets. She was led to a bathing room, far more luxurious than anything she had ever imagined, and scrubbed in a tub of scented water until her skin was raw. It was a ritual purification, a cleansing that felt less like hygiene and more like the preparation of an offering. Every trace of her former life, the dirt under her fingernails, the scent of the common people, was washed away. She was then dried with soft towels and dressed in fine linen and silk, materials so light and smooth she had never dared to touch them before. Finally, she was placed in a room filled with religious icons, crucifixes, and plush, soft furnishings, waiting for a destiny she could not yet name. She was told that the master would visit her soon. The servants, in their brief whispers, told her that he was a Polish count, a distant relative of the queen, a man of high standing and deep religious conviction who demanded absolute obedience, purity, and grace. Louison, young and trusting, believed them. She had no reason to suspect that the man who would eventually walk through that door, the man who would claim her loyalty and steal her childhood, was not a Polish count at all. When he finally appeared, stripping off his gloves with practiced ease, he was Louis XV, the King of France. And Louison was not a student. She was the latest guest in a private, highly organized establishment designed to cater to a monarch's most private, guarded whims. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look beyond the immediate scene. Most people, when they think of Versailles, imagine a world of unparalleled, almost divine beauty. They picture the hall of mirrors reflecting the light of 1,000 wax candles, the manicured geometric gardens designed by Le Notre, the rustle of silk ball gowns, and the intellectual salon culture of the Enlightenment, where philosophers debated the rights of man. History, in its polite textbooks, remembers Louis XV as le bien-aimé, the beloved. But there is a shadow beneath the gold leaf, a darkness that supports the light. The story of the Parc aux Cerfs is the story of how absolute power, when unchecked, isolates absolutely. It is not a tale of romance or the typical royal affairs that populate gossip columns. It is the documented history of a state-sponsored system of exploitation operating in the literal shadow of the throne. It is a story of young people brought from the desperate slums of Paris, groomed in a secret prison disguised as a luxury estate, used for the temporary comfort of a bored king, and then discarded when they were no longer new. To understand how a system this elaborate and monstrous was allowed to exist, we must first understand the mind of the man who utilized it. Louis XV was a complex, deeply flawed figure consumed by two overwhelming forces: boredom and fear. By the 1750s, the king had grown weary of the traditional court mistresses. These were powerful, ambitious, often older women who used their position near the king to influence politics, secure titles for their families, and manipulate state affairs. Louis, melancholic by nature, found the constant political maneuvering in his private chambers exhausting. He wanted peace, not politics. But more than the political exhaustion, Louis was terrified of death. Specifically, he was terrified of disease. Syphilis and smallpox were rampant in the French court, sparing no one, not even the highest nobility. The king viewed the experienced women of the court, those who had lived lives of intrigue, as contaminated, dangerous risks to his well-being. His doctors and his closest advisors played into this paranoia, feeding his fears. They whispered a solution that would solve both his profound boredom and his phobia of infection. They suggested that the only way to ensure the king's health was to procure partners who were undeniably safe. And in the logic of the time, safety meant youth and seclusion. The king wanted companions who had no past entanglements, no history, no scandals, and no political ambition. He wanted blank slates upon which he could project his desires without risk. And thus, the machinery of the Deer Park was set in motion. This was not a chaotic, impulsive endeavor born of a moment's passion. It was a bureaucratic operation managed with the same cold efficiency as the Royal Treasury or the War Department. At the head of this operation was not a man, but a woman, Madame de Pompadour. This is the detail that is most striking. Pompadour, the king's official mistress and arguably the most powerful woman in France, was a brilliant strategist. She realized around 1750 that her romantic relationship with the king had evolved into a platonic friendship. To maintain her grip on power and keep her position as his friend, advisor, and unofficial prime minister, she needed to control his distractions. She knew that if the king took another official mistress from the court, that woman would become Pompadour's rival. Therefore, she decided that if the king needed young companions, she would be the one to provide them. By managing the supply of these young, uneducated, and politically powerless guests, she ensured that none of them would ever become powerful enough to replace her. She became the gatekeeper of the king's private life, securing her own position by facilitating his habits. The house itself, the Parc aux Cerfs, was chosen for its extreme discretion. It was located in a quiet quarter of Versailles, close enough for the king to visit secretly by private carriage at any hour, but far enough to avoid the prying eyes of the court gossip mongers. It was overseen by the king's personal valet, a man named Dominique Guillaume Lebel. Lebel was the scout, the procurer, and the jailer. His job was to scour the streets of Paris for suitable candidates. He did not take these girls by force. The method was far more insidious and effective. He used economics. France in the mid-18th century was a place of crushing, suffocating inequality. While Versailles dined on porcelain plates, the poor of Paris lived in a short, brutal struggle against starvation. A daughter in such a family was often seen not just as a beloved child, but as another mouth to feed, a burden that a destitute family could not afford. Lebel, a master of manipulation, would approach these desperate families, cobblers, tailors, failed merchants, posing as a representative of a benevolent charitable organization or a servant of a high-ranking noble. He would offer them a deal that seemed like a miracle from above. He would promise to take their daughter, usually young and impressionable, and give her a life of comfort. He promised education in reading, writing, and religion. He promised that when she came of age, she would be given a generous dowry and married off to a respectable gentleman in the provinces. For a mother watching her other children starve, this wasn't just an offer, it was a lifeline. They entrusted their daughters with tears of gratitude, believing they were saving them from the gutter. They didn't fully grasp they were giving them over to absolute royal devotion. The arrangement was often sealed with a payment to the parents, a signing bonus that legally bound the girl to her new guardian. Once the money changed hands, the girl belonged effectively to the king's household. When a girl like Louison arrived at the deer park, she entered a world of carefully constructed narratives. The house was run by a stern woman known only as the governess, who enforced a strict, convent-like regimen. The girls were kept within the grounds. The windows were often screened to prevent them from signaling the outside world. They were discouraged from speaking to outsiders, but inside, the cage was gilded. They were given painting lessons, they learned to play the harpsichord, and they were dressed in the finest fashions of the day. They were fed rich foods, meat, game, and wine, luxuries they had only ever smelled wafting from the kitchens of the rich. This luxury served a dual purpose. First, it made the girls adaptable. A child who has known only hunger will be hesitant to question the hand that provides comfort. It created a sense of obligation and confused gratitude. Second, it prepared them for the king's specific taste. Louis didn't want a peasant girl. He wanted the fantasy of a noblewoman without the threat of one. He wanted them to carry themselves like aristocrats, but to have the compliance of a subject. The most elaborate deception, however, was the identity of the king himself. Louis was paranoid about his reputation. He knew that if the church or the public discovered the extent of his private arrangements, the scandal could destabilize the monarchy. So, a role was played. When the king visited the Parc aux Cerfs, he did not wear his crown or his royal sash. He dressed in the attire of a minor nobleman. The girls were instructed to address him as the Count or Milord. They were told he was a Polish relative of Queen Marie Leszczyńska. Imagine the perspective of these girls. They are young teenagers, isolated from their families. They are kept in a mansion, grateful for the care but wary of the rules. Then an older man arrives. He is charming. He brings gifts. He speaks with authority. They are told to honor him and to please him because he is their benefactor. They are told that their future dowry, their entire life, depends on maintaining this relationship. They didn't know they were with the state. They thought they were the secret companions of a generic nobleman. This anonymity was crucial for Louis. It allowed him to separate his actions from his divine right to rule. In the Parc aux Cerfs, he wasn't the king of France responsible for his people. He was just a man with private interests. Louison O'Murphy was one of the few who stood out briefly. She was lively, beautiful, and for a short time, she captivated the king. There are famous paintings of her from this time, resting on a sofa, depicted in the artistic style of the era. Art historians analyze the brushstrokes, the lighting, the composition. But look closer at those paintings. Look at the expression. That is the face of a young person who has been arranged. The painting isn't just art, it is a record of the king's collection. But the system of the deer park was designed for transition. It was a cycle of replacement. The king's interest was fleeting. He required constant variety to stave off his melancholy. A resident might be the favorite for a month, perhaps a year if she was particularly engaging. But eventually she would grow older. She would turn 16 or 17. In the eyes of the king, she was no longer the ideal companion he desired. Or, far more complicated, she would become pregnant. This brings us to a difficult reality of the Parc aux Cerfs. When a girl became pregnant, the atmosphere in the house shifted from indulgence to efficiency. Pregnancy was a consequence of the king's visits, treated as a situation that needed management. For the young mothers, this was the beginning of a new phase. They were moved to separate quarters, hidden even more deeply within the estate. They were cared for by midwives sworn to secrecy. But there was little celebration in these births. There were no royal announcements. When the babies were born, they were usually placed elsewhere. This was a significant emotional blow. A girl who had been given up by her parents now had to part with her own child. These infants were the biological children of the king, but on paper they were hidden. They were registered under false names, listed as the children of fictitious parents, made-up cavalry officers or non-existent merchants. They were then sent to remote schools or foster families, accompanied by a stipend. The mothers were often separated from them permanently. The king, the father of the nation, was distancing his own offspring to protect his image. He treated the situation as a necessary measure to maintain order. History records that some of these children grew up without ever knowing their true lineage. Once a girl had given birth, her time at the house often ended. She was no longer the carefree companion he sought. It was time for a new arrangement. But Louis XV ensured their future in his own way. He secured their silence. The departure from the Parc aux Cerfs was a business transaction. The king's valet, Lebel, would arrange a marriage for the girl. He would find a man, usually a minor official or clerk who needed favor. Lebel would offer a substantial dowry in exchange for marrying the girl and respecting her past. The girl would be prepared, given a new name, a sum of money, and sent to a new life. She was expected to be a respectable wife and to never speak of the house with the screened windows. This is what happened to Louison O'Murphy. Her departure was as rapid as her arrival. For a brief moment, Louison grew confident. She attempted to rival Madame de Pompadour. Believing she shared the king's influence, she was mistaken. Pompadour ensured her removal. When Louison tried to overstep, she was swiftly married off to an army officer and sent away from Versailles. She survived, but she carried the weight of her experiences for the rest of her life. As the years went on, the traffic through the Parc aux Cerfs became a steady stream. Estimates vary, but historians suggest many young women passed through this system. The scale of the operation meant that secrets began to leak. Rumors began to circulate in Paris. But because the public didn't know the exact details, their imagination conjured dark tales. The people knew the king was obsessed with youth. They knew children were vanishing into his estate. A dark folklore developed. The people believed that Louis XV was suffering from a severe affliction, and that he was using the vitality of the young to cure himself. These rumors fueled a deep resentment for the monarchy. In 1750, riots broke out in Paris when police tried to arrest street children. The mob, convinced the police were taking children for the king's purposes, attacked the officers. The beloved king had lost their trust. The Parc aux Cerfs didn't just affect the lives of young girls, it damaged the bond between the king and his people. It was one of the factors that would eventually lead to the French Revolution. There is a bitter irony in how this story ends. Louis XV spent his life avoiding illness, creating a secluded world to insulate himself. But fate is unpredictable. In 1774, the king fell ill. It was smallpox, the very disease he had feared. The King of France died a painful death. His courtiers, terrified of contagion, kept their distance. The man who had sought constant company was left largely alone in his final moments. Madame de Pompadour had died years earlier. The architects of the Deer Park were gone. When the new king, Louis XVI, ascended the throne, one of his first acts was to close the Parc aux Cerfs. The girls remaining in the house were provided for and sent away. The building was sold. The records were cleared. The monarchy tried to move past this chapter. Today, if you walk through the Saint Louis district of Versailles, you won't find a museum dedicated to these girls. The building has been repurposed many times over. It stands silent on a quiet street. But history is not just what is written in stone, it is what we choose to remember. We remember the art and the wars, but we must also remember the shadows. We must remember Louisa O'Murphy and the many girls who walked through those gates. They were part of the reality of Versailles. They were the hidden cost of a system that privileged the few. When you look at the paintings of the Rococo era, look closer. The luxury of the 18th century was complex. The Deer Park is gone. The king is dead. But the lesson remains. Power without accountability can lead to the exploitation of the vulnerable. Thank you for watching. Stories like this are difficult, but they are necessary. If you believe these histories deserve to be known, please like this video and share it. Leave a comment below. Do you think history judges Louis XV fairly? Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Until next time.